Hello everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar. The topic today is using SharePoint to enhance governance, risk, and compliance. If we can, yep. Just a brief introduction to our 30 on Thursday series. Our 30 on Thursdays is a bi-weekly 30-minute webinar series designed to keep you updated on hottest products, developments, and information available for enterprise content management. Each session is available at no cost, presented by a technical expert, and lasts about 30 minutes every other Thursday. The next webinar will take place on July 30th. The topic is CMS features that provide a personalized customer experience. If you'd like to take a look at our full schedule of upcoming webinars, please visit sharepoint.protiviti.com/webinars. We are really excited for Q&A today. If you'd like to ask questions during the webinar, please feel free to use your question window. Otherwise, if you think of anything that you'd like to know after the webinar, please feel free to tweet us at ProtivitiSP and use the hashtag 30TGovernance.
So with that, we're going to go ahead and begin with our conversation here today. Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Michael Mask. I'm a director at Protiviti, and I'm joined by Scott Wisniewski, a managing director. And we're here to share a little bit about GRC and enhancing that with SharePoint. I think we're uniquely positioned to talk about that with you guys today for two perspectives. One is Protiviti is one of the leading global business consulting and risk firms. We've got over 3,700 people, but essentially are GRC advisors. Additionally, we've made our own system for GRC called the Governance Portal, which is one of the leading tools, and that's 500-plus implementations. When you combine that with the fact that we've got a robust SharePoint team, and have done hundreds of SharePoint projects, regular contributors throughout the community doing things like this today to connect people in SharePoint, we get posed a question periodically, quite frequently, that is in essence, what do I do? Do I buy one of these? Do I build it? And a lot of folks struggle with going out in the market and finding something that fits, especially when they have a great asset like SharePoint in their own environment that they've either been forced to use, asked to use, or see as the best possible answer for them. Why that answer makes sense, I just want to articulate here a few things before we get into some case studies and then talk about our reference architecture for how we enable GRC and SharePoint is, fundamentally what we see often is that a commercial package, you basically have to do exactly what the commercial package would like you to do. You pile on another third-party tool in an already busy landscape. The requirements, oftentimes those tools were built 10 years ago when Sarbanes-Oxley got started and don't reflect maybe some of the maturing needs in the business. And you may have to do a big group hug, which is getting everyone to agree upon what GRC is. And those are typically big bang implementations as well, where you've got a very definitive kind of requirements phase and kind of long scale rollout, which is a little different than what we'll talk about with SharePoint today, which is going to give you a couple of different value points we'll talk about. And as we get into that, what Scott and I want to touch on a little bit is what makes this successful using SharePoint for GRC. Obviously, knowing SharePoint is helpful in having some talent and capability key. And then just what are these systems supposed to do? Oftentimes, if you're exclusively have an IT kind of system admin approach to this, you might not know all the nuance of what the user community expects and wants. Some folks will just try to produce lots of lists and kind of very native SharePoint out of the box, and I think that can be good for very base ones, but typically you'll need some kind of head start. A reference architecture like we'll talk about today, third-party plugins and tools, and to kind of drive this to make it really realize the promise of it. And just two other things I want to touch on is often if you use out-of-the-box SharePoint, people won't adopt it, and we know that because people like a user experience that's inviting and graphical. And it's important that you value UX as you would undertake an effort like this. And then I use the word effort because this really at one level is a project. It's not a product. So having a phased, flexible approach that's agile and can respond is one of the reasons why you would choose to use SharePoint for GRC. And specifically, how we see people using this, and many of you who joined us today, I think are going to be in these different communities, are for things like compliance, assessment, be it risk assessment, control assessment, vendor, audit. A lot of you are in different types of audit functions where you have documentation you need to manage and findings and issues. I also consider there to be a lot of policy and procedure things out there that fit very nicely into a corporate intranet using something like SharePoint. And many times, so that might be more for an audit or compliance function. We've also helped quite a few clients where the risk and compliance is embedded in the business itself, and we go direct to the business process. So as you're kind of doing a normal workflow, tracking issues, working on business process improvement, responding to incidents, SharePoint can be a tool for lines of business where they don't think about it like risk and compliance, but that's really one of the elements that's very fundamental to that. And then lastly, all the things that I think SharePoint is very good at, which is the collaboration and teaming and social aspects of this to do strategy, learning, policy, etc. Before we get into the reference architecture and kind of demonstrate and highlight a few things, I wanted to talk about some very specific examples of things that we see in GRC. And there are three ones I wanted to highlight. And looking at the roster today, we've got people in all of these industries, so hopefully you find this helpful. First example where we utilized our knowledge and reference capabilities was with one of the world's largest financial service companies, and it's focused on regulatory compliance. I want to hit a few highlights. They were subject to over 1,000 government regulations, and they had tried commercial packages, did not really fit for them, and things were changing so much, both the stakeholders, the user community, and the regulatory bodies. Really the only answer that would work for them was SharePoint. So they really recognized that, and specifically what we were able to do is team up with them and do an agile type of an approach where we had sprints, and every couple of weeks, sometimes every week, we did cycle releases. And what this led to was a way to bring a group of people together and kind of unite them in a way to do these regulatory risk assessments. And while they were a SharePoint shop already, there were some capabilities they didn't have, such as using some of the third-party plug-in tools to the workflow systems. We brought that to them, and were able to rapidly adapt that and move that. And one of the key things we did was help them move over 1 million records of data using workflow to help them with the ETL process to prepare them for the assessments and ultimately position them to meet their regulatory demands. And just a few things I want to show some highlights from this. We were able to kind of gather key risk ratings and come up with lists and entity information about requirements connected to their business, measure a multi-dimensional set of risks, controls, tests, and policies, and do some auto scoring as well. Again, what was great, a lot of the commercial tools will do what I just talked about, but we were able to layer on additional contextual information using SharePoint. So pointing them to training libraries, giving them more insight into why they're picking information, and taking different people down different paths. That was all tailored and configured using SharePoint to give them a much richer experience. And then, again, you see a kind of little snippet of the workflow off to the side. We were able in business speak to sit down with their leadership and really understand the flow and what was supposed to happen and create an algorithm that, based on the inputs, just did some auto scoring. And again, that's the kind of thing that changed at one point daily. And if we were in a commercial tool, that just never really would have been capable, but we were able to change that, adapt it, and grow it as needed as we help them with the regulatory risk scoring. Okay. Another example where kind of the reference and we were able to accelerate their solution is a large bank on the East Coast. And what they had, their kind of compelling problem that was solved with SharePoint was in a variety of distinct issue tracking mechanisms. Some were spreadsheets, some were access databases. And what we worked with them on in SharePoint is a place to unite all those. And I think what was key is instead of just taking very simple lists and making simple lists in SharePoint, we used that as an opportunity to do process re-engineering, for lack of a better word, which was they had this stage gate process where as it moved through a flow, and these are banking issues, so they may take months to resolve, we were able to to have a uniqueness, so they went down different flows and paths as they worked towards resolution. And again, this was very specific and built to fit. So exactly what they needed, they could not have got anywhere else, and has been a great system that they can own. And again, what I want to show is just kind of demonstrate one of the pictures that we created, which is a multidimensional form that allows them in very simple and easy terms to have all these different groups kind of rally around a common language and a common approach and connect the dots. And what happens is it moves through the process. Different folks are alerted. We use all the kind of bells and whistles we can in SharePoint and the workflow systems to make those all go. What else was very interesting for them is while these groups were distinct and different, they wanted to not only unite around the process, but they wanted to unite around the information. And we, creating that common information architecture that we referenced, we then were able to give them for the first time ever some common reports. So what I've got up on the board there are things about issue intelligence, and we'll talk later about the Microsoft reporting stack, but there's a couple of different ways to cut this, both from Power Pivot and Power BI and different Excel service reports. But we were able to give them this united view that then they could drill into and kind of slice and dice their issues along a lot of different dimensions. The last example that I want to talk about before we get into the reference architecture is for a leading paper product and chemical company. And they had an audit team that was spread out across a wide horizon and were inconsistent in terms of their approach, their methodology, how they kind of went about things. And a lot of the commercial tools, they press you with some hard questions. You have to be organized. You have to follow their way. You have to kind of rally around that. And what we were able to do is to give them a very simple vehicle to start that they could grow with. So they didn't have a lot of hard questions. They had work papers. They had audit files. They had issues, things that every auditor knows. And we were able to just, kind of a crawl, walk, run strategy, and the whole way through give them additional visibility into this information. And as we all know, some of this is simple, right? Giving people access to templates and to tools and making it searchable and findable and all of those things can be very important. I think one of the quick wins we focused on here, and again, I think that's very important in SharePoint, instead of waiting to implement this whole package and months or years go by before you kind of use it, you're up and running quickly, and they had very simple wins, like for the first time ever, they could see their schedule on a calendar that interacted with Outlook. They were able to watch how certain audits unfolded and where they were stalled and alert people. And that was weeks into this. That wasn't months. It wasn't a science project, and it was the kind of thing that they were able to do quite readily. Okay. What I'll do then is I'll just kind of showcase a couple of examples. You'll notice this one maybe has a little less UX and looks a little more traditional for SharePoint. But again, using concepts and ideas that people are very familiar with, and again, they can self-sustain. So I think it's very important with the SharePoint solution. What we've been working on with our clients is enabling them to be successful with SharePoint. And sometimes they have some of the talent and expertise before we get there. Other times we train as we go or we sustain as we leave. And I think what's very important with the SharePoint world is you then can add, edit, change as you need to. And I think that's key. Posting your own links, creating your own audits, managing announcements. A lot of these pieces and parts that are very familiar to everyone, and kind of how they work and they utilize. And then, as people know, we can kind of use native workflow, or we can use some of the leading third-party tools, which give you things like lazy approval and kind of email-based notifications or connecting with Skype, and expand this. And the other thing I'll add is, while this is an audit team, which might be small, they are connected to the larger enterprise. And by pushing this into an intranet, other people in the audit or compliance world, the people you're auditing, they can find you. They can interact with you. They can collaborate. You can send them surveys at the end of an audit. They can, you don't have to worry about giving them an ID or creating a user fee to have someone help manage audit and compliance. And kind of putting that on the backbone of the intranet where it's accessible and available to these wide audiences is another a great thing we see with SharePoint, and you inherit so much of that right at the start. So with that, what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Scott, who will talk a little bit about the reference architecture and kind of what's underneath some of the examples we've shown, and some of the other highlights of where we're helping people.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. So just to quickly reintroduce myself, I head up our GRC solutions offerings at Protiviti. So what's interesting about myself is my team has experience implementing GRC applications with over 500 clients since 2003. And what we've done is started to understand that there's definitely a place still in this world, an important place for off-the-shelf solutions, but also the market is also starting to look for more custom-based applications that let them really see their world the way they want to see it. A couple of key concepts as we go out and talk to clients that Michael highlighted is CIOs, your CIOs, saying not another platform, that we don't want another platform in our organization. Why can't we just use what we already have? When people are trying to do more robust things with governance, risk, and compliance, and they have some custom experiences, or I joke around that people call governance, risk, and compliance GRC, but they oftentimes leave out the G and only focus on risk and compliance. But when organizations actually do start to look at the governance activities, that's a lot of proactive, affirmative actions around communication, collaboration, sharing initiatives, and a lot of that is done on your enterprise content management system, namely for a SharePoint. And so we've started to look at this as a real opportunity to help people embed GRC practices in their knowledge management systems, which is really where it belongs, instead of, again, buying yet another platform that people have to go somewhere else for. So what we've done is we've taken our experiences that Michael's alluded to and on several of these engagements and started to really create a blueprint or a reference architecture to help expedite the types of solutions that people are building. When you look at this, and when you look at a lot of GRC applications, governance, risk, compliance, so again, to put that in vernacular you may have heard your business stakeholders ask you about, that might be someone has a Sarbanes-Oxley program that they need to manage, or an internal audit program they need to manage, or a regulatory compliance policy management program they need to manage, an IT risk management program they need to manage, or they need to do some sense of all of the above, right? All of those fall under the umbrella of GRC, but it's sort of a fancy term to describe what people are trying to do, which falls into a very specific paradigm that we've seen over these 500 implementations, and that's this concept of RWR, Repository Workflow Report. What most organizations are trying to do is they're trying to collect information in data libraries that they can push out across their businesses in some sort of relational, hierarchical way. So, for example, organizing information by their business lines, by their regulatory frameworks, by their business processes, and then, again, instantiating that information across their actual organizational structure, whether that be geographical or business line oriented. And then they're trying to execute some sort of workflow around it, right? That workflow might be trying to gain certifications from people to determine that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, or that they are aware of policies, or that they have executed testing. So they're pushing out workflow in order to gain collaborative information and feedback from organizations, and then of course they need to report on that in a few different ways. So we call that RWR, and again, what most of the off-the-shelf packages are doing is that they're just creating extensible models that help you do this. And what's interesting about SharePoint when you really dive deep into it is that it does these very things very well. However, a lot of business stakeholders really don't know it because it's either only being used in the company as a corporate intranet, or a phrase that I'll hear often is that it's a glorified file repository. And so people don't know that they can actually organize their information within these relational systems to get good reporting out of it. And then the workflow piece, as many of you on the phone call already know, is likely to be more powerful than in most organizations. So to share with you a little bit about this architecture and how we're going about helping clients build these is that first of all, when you start applying these concepts to a GRC, it starts off with defining standards and frameworks. And so we're helping organizations develop libraries that, again, can be organized by processes or your corporate risk model or regulatory themes. For those of you who are familiar with SOX, COSO is an important one, or ISO from an information security perspective. So we help you organize your information, again, into standard templates. Now, what we've seen is managed metadata is a huge factor in helping organizations do this because, again, people aren't aware that they can visualize information hierarchically, and so it becomes not so useful to them. Using managed metadata to really organize these frameworks starts to create quick filtering, quick access, and taxonomies through which they view their business. What will happen a lot of times in these GRC applications is you take information from, again, your library and you instantiate it. So you take a process template that you've developed that has risks and controls that you have to have in place, and you instantiate that within an organizational unit, say in this example, Chicago. And what that allows you to do is start to track risks, controls, tests, etc. Now again, as you look at the interface that starts to get developed, and for sure it can get customized, etc., but it's important to orient these things in a relational architecture so that, again, what we see a lot of is that, there's just a list. People just proliferate lists, but they don't really have relationship to one another. It's important to create these lists in an architecture that is organized by the taxonomies you've created that gives single views of objectives, risks, controls, and tests. And so what we're doing in this respect is first of all, and totally understand that this is going to be difficult to read, but we're building an information architecture around that with core content types. So core content types that relate to these types of solutions include, elements of the library. So that has a lot to do with elements of the library as well as what we refer to as that core register that contain IDs of where information originates, how it gets instantiated into a register, so that over time people can sync information back and forth, that as you build out your library, you can push that out to the register. As you update your register, you might want to share that back with your library. So building out content types that allow for, again, data elements to be shared. Other core concepts in this repository are the concept of entities. Almost every GRC implementation revolves around some sort of concept of an entity around which information is shared. Again, an entity could be an IT application, an organizational unit, a geography, a specific regulatory body that you need to track regulations for. But the concept of entity provides security around this. And then there's something we refer to as component types. And component types are where you start to build out your business records, your risks, your controls, your incidents, your action plans, whatever you need to track in your business. Again, what's key for this audience to know is that in a lot of GRC applications, especially as they go enterprise, the need for greater and greater extensibility to build out your data library is becoming an imperative, and using SharePoint ahead of off-the-shelf solutions will allow you to extend your requirements and extend the solution as your requirements evolve. Other key things to know about this relational repository are that there's core workflows that are associated with it in order to affect that library to register sync. In order to organize information by entity and actually manage security and provisioning by entity. So one of the challenges with SharePoint is that it has an awesome native security, obviously, that uses LDAP, highly integrates with your business and your enterprise, but it actually doesn't manage security in the way that many business stakeholders organize their security, namely by entity. And so another core element of the reference architecture is developing the core workflows that allow data to be arranged by these entities and security to be provisioned by these entities, also alleviating some of the native traps or caps that SharePoint puts on you in terms of amount of data you can manage in lists. The other thing that we move on to is workflow. So there's a number of use cases for workflow. Again, going back to the last slide, managing data in that repository is a huge first step that people have not been doing for many years. But what a lot of practitioners do already know is that the workflow in SharePoint is extremely powerful, and a lot of times, again, more powerful than you're going to find in a lot of OTS off-the-shelf packages. It allows for better integration into subsystems that can support the analytics or the continuous controls monitoring that many businesses are looking for in their GRC efforts. It can help you with really completely user-definable business rules and aggregation that many organizations are looking at. They have complex risk scoring or scenario analysis types of structures. Michael alluded to that in terms of the regulatory risk scoring earlier. It also allows for just workflow across many different GRC use case examples, including testing, assessment, certification, policy updates. Remediation is a huge one, and exception management. The one thing I would draw upon here is that a lot of the workflow, again, is going to be workflow that you as a set of practitioners of SharePoint are already very familiar with via SharePoint or popular third-party products. One of the things we've noted from a GRC perspective is that there's a need to do assessments in sort of a multi-line update type of capability that is actually updating that underlying register. So it's not quite a survey, but it behaves like a survey. And so, again, we're developing workflows that allow for this survey apparatus to execute, as well as small code snippets that allow for things that, again, SharePoint doesn't natively do in terms of allowing some fields and lists to be editable while allowing other fields to be non-editable in, again, a multi-list edit view that people are used to in the GRC world in terms of the way they assess, for example, in this case, their controls. With respect to business intelligence, Michael also has a lot of experiences with the customers he's talked about in terms of leveraging that BI stack.
Yeah, what's important is that depending on your situation, you've got a lot of choices. If it's SSRS, if it's Excel, and everything in between, we can work with you, and as you know you can, and just kind of bring the right thing for the right need. Some have cost implications, some performance, some functional, and there is a lot of choice, and I would say more than in many particular packages that we have.
Now the key to that is that in a GRC setting, that's used really in three key paradigms. It's used for dashboarding. That's kind of obvious. Almost anything you all do these days has a dashboard perspective. I think, again, incorporating it, embedding it into your enterprise stack makes capabilities available to the business that they don't have an off-the-shelf, such as enterprise search, and using the concepts of the refiners in that search to look at specific types of risks, like around their risk model, accounting information, or access, or the effectiveness of risk mitigation plans. So using that enterprise search leverages capabilities that they wouldn't have off the shelf. And then the other thing, again, that organizations using SharePoint don't probably do to the best effect because they don't have these relational structures is use it for ad hoc query. And so we've been really working with clients to create the pivot type of analysis that's used through Excel services to define certain data relationships that allow them to query their data very quickly, very seamlessly, because again, in a GRC setting, those are some of the essentials for them actually being able to slice and dice their data in the way they need to. So, this was a very quick run through the concept of using and leveraging SharePoint for governance, risk, and compliance, talking about some examples of clients where we've implemented it, as well as the abstraction of creating a reference architecture that follows this RWR abstraction that allows you to build solutions quickly in SharePoint.
And we've got a few moments, and Scott and I certainly want to hang around for any questions. You can submit those through the chat. We've had a few already, and one of the questions is from a version standpoint, what version of SharePoint? We've seen this mostly in SharePoint 2013, but we have helped clients all the way going back to SharePoint 2010, as well as with Office 365. I think one of the things with Office 365 is there's a newness to it and kind of early adopter mode where you've got to understand that and be willing to kind of work on things related to branding and other kind of challenges there. That was definitely one of the questions. So if you can go ahead and if you have those questions, let's enter them into the chat that's available. Another one here that I see is the kind of responsive, and I think this is a big value point for SharePoint. A lot of the kind of the GRC systems floating around do not have mobile or device options. If they do, they're sort of watered down and certainly not mobile first. I think as people know, SharePoint can certainly be made responsive, and we have begun working with clients to do a responsive first design. So we'll design against the phone or the tablet and then work backwards to the desktop. And there's a lot of great collaboration devices that play well in GRC world. You know, taking videos if you're an auditor or doing a store audit, you know, pictures, images, collaboration. You know, these are all things that are basically inherited, right? You know, where people can connect and talk about enterprise risk management, share good practices, things of that nature. So one of the things that I wanted to bring up. So we'll wait another moment to see if any other kind of chats come through. And if not, we'll break. But I see here's another question that came through. What is an example approach to manage many-to-many relationships of entities in SharePoint? I'll let Scott kind of talk about how we've kind of, if not solved that problem, at least kind of minimize that and made it a little more functional.
Sure, yeah. You know, there is some core code related to that. So in general, you know, there's going to be parent-child linkage tables that are created, and then within the forms, there are code snippets that are needed in order to basically pass parameters back and forth. Now, one of the challenges in that is that, you know, I think a lot of practitioners kind of know how to build a lot of code, but the problem with that is that it doesn't become a very extensible capability, because the very next thing you need to link together, you basically need to recode entire solutions. So we talked a little bit about creating, using content types to create core elements of our architecture as well as core workflows. So what we're doing is we are developing core workflows that relate to list to list with linkage tables in between, whereby there's a code library that can be referenced and basically a variable changed and swapped out of that library, that code library, so that as you now need to create the next linkage table, you're able to do that again with very minimal code. So I think that's one of the tenets of trying to make this extensible, is limiting the amount of code, although it won't ever be no code, but it's certainly not code that needs to go on the server, and it's very low code types of solutions that make it extensible.
Good. You know, one of the things, I think we're good from a question standpoint. So if there are any others, please let those come into the chat, and we'll follow up with individual questions. I think we might have one other kind of technical one that we can do some follow-up on. But if there are no other questions from anyone in the group, we'll pause here for a moment, and would like to say thank you very much for your time and joining us in the 30 on 30 series. Hope you got a lot out of this. The recording is available. I encourage you to sign up for other sessions that are similar in nature to this, and we will be happy if, you know, Scott and myself are up on the board here. So, and I want to thank Angela as well for joining us here today. And feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. That, you know, a lot of times this is a kind of a sparking type of event where you're like, oh, I didn't think about that, or kind of rattle around some ideas, and if things crystallize or you need help with things, certainly please let us know, because we're happy to. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and we'll conclude the broadcast, Angela, and we'll say goodbye and thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.